When this elderly grandmother sold her son's prized Harley-Davidson to pay her medical bills while he was deployed overseas, she thought she'd lost the last piece of him forever. But what happened when a stranger bought that bike and posted her story online? Could anyone have predicted the moment that would bring an entire community to tears? The garage door creaked open on rusty hinges, and the smell hit Margaret like a wave of memory, so strong she had to steady herself against the doorframe. Motor oil and old leather, mixed with that particular metallic scent of chrome that had been sitting untouched for too long. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the single window, and there it sat like a sleeping giant, the Harley-Davidson that her son Eric had loved more than just about anything in this world. The black paint still gleamed under the layer of dust, and the chrome parts caught the light in ways that made her heart ache. She stood there for a long moment, just breathing, just looking, her worn slippers barely making a sound on the concrete floor that was stained with 3 decades of oil changes and hard work. Margaret was 72 years old, and her hands shook these days even when she didn't want them to. The arthritis had gotten worse over the winter, making her fingers twist in ways that hurt to look at. Her gray hair was pulled back in the same simple bun she'd worn for 40 years, and her house dress hung loose on her frame because she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. She'd stopped eating much lately, not because she wasn't hungry, but because every time she sat down at the kitchen table, all she could think about was her boy, Eric, her only child. The son who used to sit in that very chair and tell her stories about his day while wolfing down her homemade meatloaf like he hadn't eaten in weeks. The bike sat in the center of the garage like a monument to better times. It was a 1973 Harley-Davidson shovelhead, though Margaret didn't know all the technical names for things. She just knew that Eric had been 16 years old when he first saw it at an estate sale across town. The owner had died, and his widow was selling everything. Eric had worked 3 jobs that summer, flipping burgers at the diner, mowing lawns in the blazing heat, and stocking shelves at the grocery store until his back ached. He'd saved every single dollar, counting his money each night at the kitchen table with the kind of focus most boys his age saved for video games or girls. Margaret walked closer to the bike now, her footsteps slow and careful. She reached out and touched the leather seat, and it was cool and cracked under her fingertips. She remembered the day Eric had brought it home on a trailer, how it had been in pieces, broken and sad-looking. But Eric had seen something in it that nobody else could see. He'd spent 2 years rebuilding it with his grandfather, her father, who'd known motorcycles like some people know the Bible. Every Sunday, they'd been out here together, the old man teaching the young boy, passing down knowledge that went back generations. The sound of their laughter had filled this garage, mixed with the clang of tools and the smell of grease and the classic rock station playing on an old radio that still sat on the workbench in the corner. Her father was gone now, had been for 8 years, and Eric was gone too, though in a different way. He was overseas, serving his 3rd tour in a desert so far away it might as well be another planet. The army had sent him there 9 months ago, and for the first 7 months, the letters had come regular as clockwork. Every Tuesday, Margaret would walk down to the mailbox at the end of her driveway, and there would be an envelope with Eric's handwriting, telling her he was safe, telling her he was eating enough, telling her not to worry even though they both knew that's all a mother does when her child is in harm's way. But then the letters stopped. 2 months ago, they just stopped coming. Margaret had called the number they gave her, and a polite young woman with a voice like honey told her that everything was fine, that Eric was just in a remote location where mail moved slow. Sometimes it takes weeks, the woman had said, sometimes months, But he's safe, ma'am. I promise you, he's safe. But promises from strangers don't mean much when you lie awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, wondering if your boy is cold or hungry or scared or worse. The bills had started piling up on the kitchen counter around the same time the letters stopped. Margaret's medication costs had jumped from $100 a month to $300, and nobody could explain why, except to say, that's just how things work now. The roof was leaking in 2 places, one over the guest bedroom and one over the bathroom, and every time it rained, she had to put out buckets to catch the water that dripped down like tears. She lived on a fixed income, Social Security, and a tiny pension from the factory where she'd worked for 30 years before they closed it down. She'd already refinanced the house twice, borrowing against the only thing she owned in this world. Standing in that garage, with autumn wind rattling the loose boards on the back wall and her medicine bottles empty on the bathroom counter and the roof leaking and her boy so far away he might as well be on the moon, Margaret felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart exactly, but something close to it. She pulled her old flip phone from her dress pocket, the kind with actual buttons that her younger neighbors made fun of. Her hand shook as she took a picture of the Harley, the flash making the chrome blaze like fire. She'd made her decision, even though it felt like cutting off her own arm. She would list the bike online tonight, and whatever money it brought would have to be enough. Margaret sat at her kitchen table that night under the weak yellow light of the overhead bulb, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she stared at her old laptop that Eric had bought her 5 years ago. Her fingers hovered over the keys, shaking so badly she had to stop twice and take deep breaths. She'd never sold anything online before, didn't really understand how it all worked, but her neighbor's daughter had shown her the basics once. The screen glowed blue in the dark kitchen, and outside the window, she could hear the wind picking up, rustling through the oak tree that Eric used to climb when he was small. She typed slowly, one letter at a time, making mistakes and going back to fix them. For sale, Harley-Davidson motorcycle, 1973. She didn't know what else to write, so she just put down that it ran good, that it had been kept in a garage, that it was special. She uploaded the picture she'd taken that afternoon, the one where the chrome caught the light just right. Then she sat back and stared at what she'd done, feeling like she'd just signed away a piece of her soul. The price she listed was $5,000, which was probably too low, but she didn't care about getting rich. She just needed enough to pay the bills that were spreading across the table like a paper invasion, red stamps and final notices screaming at her in bold letters. The phone started ringing within 2 hours. The first call came from a man who sounded young and excited, asking questions she couldn't answer about engines and parts and things she'd never understood. She told him he could come look at it if he wanted. Then another call came, and another, until she had to turn the ringer off because it was past 10 o'clock and she needed to think. She lay in bed that night, not sleeping, just staring at the shadows on the ceiling and remembering. She remembered Eric at 16, covered in grease up to his elbows, grinning like he'd won the lottery when he finally got the engine to turn over for the first time. She remembered his grandfather standing beside him, one weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, pride shining in his old eyes. She remembered the first time Eric took the bike out for a real ride. How he'd circled the block 6 times because he couldn't stop smiling, couldn't believe this beautiful machine was actually his. He'd come back with wind-blown hair and red cheeks, talking so fast his words ran together, saying, "Mom, it's like flying. It's like freedom. It's the best thing I've ever felt." By Saturday morning, a young man named Connor knocked on her front door. He was maybe 25, tall and thin, wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt, and when Margaret opened the door, his eyes were bright with hope. "Ma'am, I'm here about the Harley," he said, and his voice was respectful in a way that reminded her of Eric. She led him out to the garage, her slippers scuffing on the driveway, and when she opened that creaky door again, Connor just stopped and stared. "This is a '73 shovelhead," he breathed, walking toward it like he was approaching something holy. "Ma'am, do you know how rare these are? Your son took incredible care of this. Look at this paint job. Look at these chrome pipes. This is perfect." He ran his hand over the seat, touched the handlebars with gentle fingers, and Margaret had to look away because watching him love the bike made her chest hurt. "He rebuilt it himself," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the garage. "Him and his grandfather. Took them 2 years. Every Sunday, they were out here working on it." Connor looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw his expression change as he understood this wasn't just a bike. This was a story. This was love made into metal and chrome. "Where is your son now?" Connor asked, and there was something soft in his voice that made Margaret's eyes sting with tears she'd been holding back for days. "He's overseas," she managed to say, the words sticking in her throat like broken glass. "Serving his 3rd tour. The letters stopped coming 2 months ago. They say he's fine, just somewhere remote. But I don't know. I don't know anything anymore." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold even though it was a warm September morning. Connor was quiet for a long moment, just standing there beside the bike. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, thick with cash. "I can give you $5,000 right now," he said. "Cash. I've been saving for 2 years for a bike like this." Margaret nodded, unable to speak, and watched him count out the bills slowly, carefully, treating each one like it mattered. 50 $100 bills, crisp and green, the paper making soft sounds as he stacked them on the workbench. She took the money with trembling hands and gave him the title, the piece of paper she'd kept in a drawer for 15 years with Eric's name on it. Connor helped her push the bike out of the garage, and the wheels made tracks in the thin layer of dust on the concrete floor. He threw one leg over it, settled into the seat that Eric had sat in 1,000 times, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, loud and powerful, filling the quiet neighborhood with sound. Margaret felt each rev like a punch to her stomach. She watched him ride away down her street, the rumble of the engine getting quieter and quieter until it was gone completely. Then she stood in her empty driveway, the cash heavy in her hands, and cried like she hadn't cried since Eric's father died 20 years ago. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and spread the cash out in front of her, like a fan of cards she didn't want to play. The bills looked so clean and new under the overhead light, and she counted them 3 times to make sure it was all there. $5,000. It seemed like so much money, and not nearly enough at the same time. She pulled out the stack of bills from the drawer where they'd been hiding like shameful secrets, and one by one she wrote checks. $300 for the medicine, $800 for the roof repair, $200 for the electric bill that was 2 months overdue, $150 for the water. The money disappeared faster than snow in summer, and when she was done, she had exactly $400 left. She tucked it into an envelope and wrote Eric's name on it, then sat down with a piece of paper and a pen. Her handwriting was shaky, but she wrote it all down. Every word. She told him about the medicine costs tripling, about the roof leaking, about lying awake at night, worrying about him and worrying about money, and feeling like she was drowning in worries that had no end. She told him she was sorry. So sorry. Sorrier than she'd ever been about anything in her whole life. She told him the bike had gone to a good person, someone who would love it the way Eric had loved it. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her nightstand drawer, along with the receipt Connor had written on a torn piece of paper, his handwriting messy but readable. Then she turned off the light and cried herself to sleep. The story started small, the way all stories do in little towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. Margaret went to the grocery store on Monday morning, and Mrs. Peterson from church stopped her in the produce section, touching her arm with wrinkled fingers. "I heard about Eric's bike," she said, her voice low and sad. "You poor dear, you must be heartbroken." Margaret just nodded and moved on, but she could feel eyes on her back as she picked through the apples, searching for ones that weren't bruised. At church on Sunday, people whispered behind their hands, and some looked at her with soft eyes full of pity, while others pressed their lips tight like they were judging her, deciding whether she'd done the right thing or the wrong thing. The diner on Main Street had always been the heart of town gossip, and by Tuesday, everyone who came in for coffee was talking about it. Some people understood. Old Bill Henderson, who'd lost his farm during the last recession, nodded his gray head and said, "Sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do to survive." But others weren't so kind. Margaret heard through her neighbor that some folks were saying she should have asked for help, should have gone to the church, should have found another way. The words stung like wasps, even secondhand. But then something happened that nobody saw coming. Connor, the young man who'd bought the Harley, went home that Saturday night and couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's face when she'd watched him ride away. He sat in his small apartment, the bike parked outside like a dream come true. But the dream felt heavy somehow. He pulled out his phone and opened up his social media, and he started typing. He didn't just post a picture of his new bike. He posted Margaret's story. He wrote about a mother who'd given up the one thing her son loved most in this world because she had no other choice. He wrote about Eric serving overseas, about the letters that stopped coming, about sacrifice and love, and impossible decisions that nobody should have to make. He wrote about what it means to serve your country and what it costs the families left behind. He hit post and put his phone down, not expecting much. But the internet works in mysterious ways. By morning, the post had been shared 50 times. By afternoon, 500. By evening, it had exploded across the country like wildfire, spreading from screen to screen, heart to heart. Strangers who'd never heard of their little town or Margaret or Eric started commenting, sharing, crying over their keyboards. Some of them were mothers. Some were veterans. Some were just people who understood what it meant to make hard choices. And then the money started coming. Small amounts at first, $5 from a college student, $10 from a grandmother in California, $20 from a veteran in Texas who wrote, "For Eric's mom," from one military family to another. Margaret's phone started ringing off the hook on Wednesday morning, and she didn't understand why until her neighbor came running over, breathless and excited, shoving a tablet in her face. "Margaret, look, you're famous. People all over the country are reading about you." Margaret stared at the screen, her hands shaking, trying to make sense of the numbers. Thousands of shares, tens of thousands of comments, and a donation link that Connor had set up, filling with money from strangers who cared about people they'd never met. Veterans organizations started calling, offering help. The local construction company owner, a gruff man named Tom, who'd never said more than hello to her in 15 years, showed up at her door and told her his crew would fix her roof for free. The diner put out a collection jar with Eric's name on it and a picture of him in his uniform, and by Friday it was overflowing with bills and coins. News crews arrived in their white vans with satellite dishes on top, wanting to interview her, wanting to film her house and her garage and capture her story for the evening broadcast. Margaret didn't know what to say to the cameras, just kept repeating, "I only did what I had to do." But that seemed to make people love her more. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Margaret had watched Connor ride away on Eric's Harley, when she heard the sound of a vehicle pulling into her driveway. She was in the kitchen making tea, her hands still shaking the way they did these days, when she looked out the window and saw the military transport truck parked on the street. Her heart stopped. Actually stopped beating for what felt like a full minute. In every military family's nightmares, official vehicles showing up unannounced meant only one thing, the worst thing, the thing you prayed about every single night. She dropped the teacup and it shattered on the floor, hot water spreading across the linoleum, but she didn't even notice. Her legs carried her to the front door without her really deciding to move, and her hand fumbled with the lock. She got the door open just as a figure stepped out of the truck, and the morning sun was behind him, so she couldn't see his face clearly. But she knew that shape. She knew the way he moved. She knew him in her bones the way only a mother knows her child. "Eric," she whispered, and then louder, "Eric!" Her voice cracked and broke on his name like glass hitting pavement. He was thinner than she remembered, his uniform hanging a little loose on his frame, and there were new lines around his eyes that made him look older than 28. But it was her boy, her beautiful boy, walking across the yard toward her with quick, long steps. She stumbled down the porch steps, and he caught her before she fell, wrapping his arms around her so tight she could barely breathe. He smelled like airplane fuel and that special military soap, and underneath it all, like Eric, like home. "Mom," he said into her hair, and his voice was thick with tears. "Mom, I'm here. I'm okay. I'm home." They stood there in the driveway for a long time, holding each other and crying, and Margaret didn't care that the neighbors could see, didn't care about anything except that her son was solid and warm and alive in her arms. "How?" she finally managed to ask, pulling back to look at his face, to touch his cheeks and make sure he was real. "They said you couldn't leave. They said it would be months before—" Eric wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Someone in my unit saw the post. Connor's post about you and the bike. It went viral, Mom. Everyone was sharing it. My sergeant showed it to our commanding officer, and they pulled strings. Emergency leave. I got on a transport yesterday." He looked at her seriously then, and she saw guilt in his eyes. "I'm so sorry. I should have sent more money. I should have made sure you were okay. The bike, Mom. I can't believe you had to sell." But she put her hand over his mouth, stopping the words. "Hush now. You're home. That's all that matters. That's the only thing in this world that matters." And she meant it with every fiber of her being. The news spread through town faster than it had the first time. Within an hour, neighbors started appearing. Mrs. Peterson brought a casserole. Old Bill Henderson came by to shake Eric's hand, his grip firm despite his age. Families with children waving small American flags lined up on the sidewalk. The local veterans group arrived in their leather jackets, surrounding Eric with quiet understanding, the kind that only comes from people who've been where he'd been. The diner owner brought sandwiches. The grocery store manager brought drinks. It was like the whole town had been waiting for this moment, needing this moment, wanting to be part of something good. And then, around 2 in the afternoon, they heard it. the deep rumble of a motorcycle engine coming down the street, growing louder with each second. Margaret and Eric were sitting on the porch, and they both looked up at the same time. Connor rode into view on the Harley, the sunlight catching the chrome and making it shine like it had in Eric's best days. He pulled into the driveway, slowly, carefully, and cut the engine. The sudden silence felt loud. Connor got off the bike and stood there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking at Eric with something like awe on his young face. "You must be Eric," he said quietly. "I'm Connor. I'm the guy who bought your bike." Eric stood up, walked down the porch steps, and the two men faced each other in the driveway while the whole neighborhood watched. "This bike," Connor said, his voice steady but emotional. "It did something I never expected. It brought people together. It reminded a whole country what matters, what sacrifice looks like, what love looks like." He pulled the keys from his pocket, and they jangled softly in his hand. "And it belongs with your family. It always belonged with your family." He held out the keys, and Eric just stared at them. "I can't," Eric said. "You paid for it. You saved up for 2 years. My mom told me on the phone. That's your bike now." But Connor shook his head. "The community raised money, more than enough to pay me back, more than enough to help your mom with everything she needs. This bike is yours. It was always yours." He pressed the keys into Eric's hand and closed his fingers around them. "It's been an honor, the greatest honor of my life to be part of this story." Eric looked at his mother, and she was crying again. But these were different tears. Happy tears. Relief tears. The kind that wash away pain instead of adding to it. He looked at Connor, at the neighbors gathered on the lawn, at the bike sitting there in the driveway where it had always belonged. And he understood then that the Harley had become more than metal and chrome. It had become proof that people still cared, that communities still helped their own, that love always finds a way home. The sun was setting over their small town, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, and Eric walked over to the bike. He ran his hand over the seat, the same way he'd done 1,000 times before. Margaret came down and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. The motorcycle sat between them and the garage, right where it belonged, gleaming in the fading light. And for the first time in 3 years, Margaret felt like she could finally breathe. Really breathe. Because her son was home, the bike was home, and sometimes, just sometimes, the world gives back what you thought you'd lost forever.